Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're all doing great. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing folks from all over the place tuning in. The night wind clawed through the bare trees like talons, whipping across the snow-covered ground. The blizzard had arrived earlier than forecast, draping the countryside of Fair Hollow under a heavy, suffocating veil of white. The headlights of Lucas Hart's battered old pickup cut thin beams through the thick fog, the familiar rattle of the aging engine the only sound in the frozen stillness. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tighter, his worn leather gloves damp with condensation. He was no stranger to late-night deliveries, part job, part habit. In the quiet of the night, the past didn't loom quite so heavily. He could breathe, even if it wasn't easy. As his truck rounded the bend near the old Birch Hollow church, a strange, flickering light ahead made him slam on the brakes. An angry, glowing smear of red-orange bled through the mist. His heart clenched. Lucas accelerated, the tires grinding against the ice. Seconds later, the scene sharpened into terrifying clarity. A school bus, teetering on the shoulder of the frozen road, its rear engulfed in flames. He skidded to a halt, the pickup sliding sideways onto the shoulder. Before thinking, he was out of the truck, boots sinking into the soft snow. The freezing wind lashed his face, but the searing heat from the burning bus was far more savage. Explosions popped and cracked as the fire devoured the vehicle's frame. Through the black smoke, Lucas heard it, faint but undeniable, a child's cry. He ran, every step a battle against the sinking snow. The emergency exit was jammed shut. Without hesitation, Lucas threw his elbow into the window. The glass shattered, the sound loud and urgent against the silence of the night. Inside, smoke coiled thickly. Seats were twisted, debris scattered everywhere. Through the chaos, two small figures huddled under a mangled bench seat. One little girl clutching a scorched teddy bear, the other trembling, her wide, terrified eyes catching the firelight. Lucas dropped to his knees, feeling the inferno growing behind him. "Hey," he rasped through the smoke, "listen to me. We're getting out. Right now." Without waiting for fear to root them in place, he reached through the wreckage, scooping each child into an arm. Metal groaned overhead, the body of the bus collapsing further. Behind him, the fire howled like a living thing. Lucas squeezed through the shattered window, lunging outward just as the rear section of the bus imploded in a violent roar. The blast seared his back, flames licking at the hem of his jacket. Clutching the children tightly, he dove into the snow, rolling to smother any embers. Pain flared up his left shoulder, but Lucas ignored it. He checked the children, coughing, shivering, bleeding, but alive. Wrapping them tighter inside his jacket, he sprinted back toward his truck. Behind them, the bus erupted into a towering inferno, casting monstrous shadows across the frozen field. Lucas set the girls in the back seat of the pickup. He rummaged through his supply box, pulling out an old wool blanket. He tucked it carefully around their small frames, inspecting for deeper injuries. One girl had a deep gash on her forehead, already crusting over. The other was uninjured but shivering violently. Tiny fingers clutched at his wrist. The wide-eyed girl whispered hoarsely, "My bear, please." Lucas hesitated. Through the crackling fire, he could still see the mangled interior of the bus. Common sense told him no, but something else, something deeper, pushed him forward. Without a word, he turned back toward the blaze. Minutes later, Lucas returned, soot-streaked and coughing, but holding the half-scorched teddy bear. The little girl sobbed, clutching it to her chest, as though it were life itself. Lucas ruffled her soot-matted hair. "You're safe now," he whispered. In the distance, the wail of sirens pierced the night, closer now. Ambulances and fire trucks, their lights slicing through the snowstorm. Lucas backed away into the shadows. He knew what would follow. Questions, flashing cameras, headlines. He wanted no part of it. Before anyone could spot him, he climbed into his pickup, steering it carefully away, leaving behind only fading tire tracks in the snow. The children, wrapped in blankets, watched him disappear, whispering to each other that their hero smelled like motor oil and honey biscuits. That night, back in his cold trailer, Lucas sat by the dim glow of the wood stove. His hands, raw from burns and frostbite, cradled a chipped mug of black coffee. Outside, the wind howled across the barren land. He stared down at his battered hands, then out into the endless white. No one knew his name. No one needed to, because in that fragile, flickering peace warming his chest, Lucas understood something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pride. It wasn't glory. It was a quiet kind of peace. A small, stubborn knowing that tonight, even if the world forgot, he had done the right thing. Dawn in Fair Hollow never rushed. Light crept slowly across rooftops glazed with mist, laying a thin silver sheen over the sleeping fields. The bare trees shivered under the first chill breath of winter. Inside a weathered trailer perched at the edge of the woods, Lucas Hart sipped black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He didn't turn on the lights. The old wood stove hummed quietly, casting a flickering glow on the peeling walls. Mornings like this had once been a balm for him, a place of silence, of breathing. But today, the quiet gnawed at him. Images from a night before clung to him like smoke. The savage blaze. The sound of children's cries cutting through the inferno. The weight of small bodies in his arms, reeking of smoke and fear. Lucas exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the mug, trying to warm parts of himself that had long gone cold. The low, unfamiliar rumble of an engine drifted in from the driveway. He froze. His old pickup never sounded that polite. Neighbors around here didn't own anything smoother than a rusted muffler. Setting his coffee down, Lucas grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The sight hit him instantly. A gleaming Rolls-Royce silver cloud sat awkwardly in the muddy track leading to the trailers, its presence surreal amid the worn-out landscape. The rear door opened. A woman stepped out. She wore a slate-gray wool coat, its collar turned up against the cold. Her ash-blonde hair was pinned neatly with a silver clasp. Everything about her, the way she stood, the way the morning light embraced her, radiated a poised, chilly elegance. But her storm-gray eyes, when they found Lucas, held something else entirely. Recognition. Shock. Something that cracked through both of them. Lucas felt his heartbeat stumble. Impossible. But the eyes never lied. Caroline, he breathed. Her name drifted into the cold air like a prayer long buried. Caroline Rhodes, the woman he had once considered family. The woman who had once held the hand of the brother Lucas had loved and lost. Caroline walked toward him, each step measured, her soft leather shoes barely leaving a mark in the wet earth. Her chauffeur stayed discreetly by the car, looking away, leaving this moment to them, two souls tangled in an unfinished story. "We need to talk," Caroline said, voice low but cutting through years of silence. Lucas swallowed hard, every muscle in his body tightening like an overwound string. "I don't think there's anything left to say," he rasped. "Not about me," Caroline replied, her gaze steady. "About the children." The words cut through him like a slow, deliberate knife. He turned away, staring into the skeletal trees, as if the frozen landscape could shield him from the rawness clawing its way up his chest. Caroline stepped closer. "I know it was you," she said softly. "I saw the footage. I saw how you carried them, shielded them, like they were your whole world." Lucas said nothing. Old memories surged. Fights with his brother, bitter words, unspoken truths. "You don't owe me anything," Caroline continued, her voice trembling slightly but her eyes fierce. "But I owe you. I owe you an apology for not believing you." The words, once unimaginable, now filled the space between them. Lucas clenched his fists, fingernails biting into calloused palms. How many years had it been? 8? 10? How many nights had he wondered? If only she believed him, would everything have been different? Caroline saw the battle raging inside him. She took another tentative step forward, like someone walking a frozen lake, knowing one wrong move could break it all. "I'm not here asking for forgiveness," she whispered. "I'm just here to tell you, you were right." The wind tore through the trees, carrying the scents of snow, damp earth, and old regrets. Finally, Lucas looked at her. His eyes, once oceans filled with youth and hope, were now deep, quiet waters. In Caroline's face, he saw no arrogance, no righteous glow, only weariness, hard-earned understanding, and a rare, desperate courage. They stood there, silent against the frozen world. A stronger gust tugged at Caroline's collar, lifting strands of hair across her forehead. Lucas spoke first, his voice raw. "The girls, are they okay?" A fragile, luminous smile flickered across Caroline's lips. "They're safe. They're alive. Because of you." Lucas simply nodded. He didn't want praise. He didn't need applause. He just needed to know those tiny hearts were still beating under this heavy sky. Caroline turned, retrieving a small, neatly wrapped package from the car. She offered it to him with both hands. "They made this for you," she said. "Last night, after I told them." Lucas unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside were 2 crayon drawings. A tall man holding 2 little girls, surrounded by flames and falling snow. In the corner, in clumsy block letters, it read, "To Fire Hands, our hero. Love, Maisie and Willa." Lucas' chest tightened. He had never thought himself a hero, had never expected or even wanted to be called one. Yet here it was, raw, real, undeniable. Caroline watched him quietly, then spoke with aching gentleness. "If you ever want to visit, if you ever feel like you could, we would love to have you." Lucas stared at the drawing again, feeling something old and broken inside him stir. Not a demand, not a plea, just a door cracked open against the cold. He closed his fingers carefully around the drawing, holding the delicate gift as if it might shatter in his rough hands. Lucas' heart, the silent mechanic who ran toward the flames, had saved 2 lives that night. But maybe, just maybe, they were saving him too. Not with headlines, not with medals, but with something rarer. A second chance. A family reborn. The wind from the lakeshore swept through, carrying a biting chill and the rustling sound of dry leaves skimming across the ground. Lucas' heart leaned against his battered old pickup truck, his eyes fixed on Caroline Rhodes, the woman who carried a piece of his past he'd spent years trying to forget. They had left the snow-covered clearing behind, walking slowly toward a small open patch within the forest, a place where he and his brother once camped, once shared dreams and teenage secrets. Here, there were no witnesses, no judgmental stares, only 2 people, facing truths they'd avoided for far too long. Caroline pulled her coat tighter around herself, her hands buried deep in her pockets, as if searching for something solid to cling to. "I don't know where to start," she said, voice so small that Lucas had to lean closer to hear. "Then start with the truth," Lucas replied, his voice carrying no bitterness, only a quiet weariness. She looked up at him, those gray eyes that had once made him feel safe in a chaotic world, now brimming with regret. "Back then," she began, "when you told me about Asher, I thought you were jealous." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, as if her words were tiny needles pressing into scars that had never fully healed. "You were the only one willing to confront him," Caroline continued, each word scraping painfully out of her throat. "When you told me about what he'd done in his unit, the bad decisions, the cruelty, the unforgivable acts, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't." A sharp gust of wind shook the bare branches above them. Lucas shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets, standing silent, letting the wind speak for him. "You were the only one who saw what I refused to see," Caroline whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And instead of believing you, I turned away." Lucas let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You loved him," he said, voicing the truth they had both once buried. "You had every reason not to want to see." Caroline nodded, the tears falling freely now. But the price, she choked out, the price of that silence was too high. They stood there, among the skeletal trees and frozen earth, 2 people carrying nameless, heavy ruins. Lucas remembered nights on base, when the rumors about Asher started, the unauthorized orders, the acts everyone chose to ignore. He had reported it, and he'd lost everything. Friends, comrades, and worst of all, Caroline, who had refused to listen. But now, as she stood before him, her shoulders trembling, hands clutching at her coat like a lost child. Lucas no longer felt anger. Only sorrow. Sorrow for what might have been saved if they had all been braver sooner. "Do you hate me?" Caroline asked, her voice cracking. It took Lucas a long moment to answer. "No," he said simply. Caroline blinked at him, as if she hadn't quite believed her own question deserved mercy. "There was a time I did," Lucas admitted, voice low, honest. "I hated you for trusting him over me. I hated myself for thinking that if I just fought harder, you'd see the truth." He paused, drawing in a breath so sharp it stung his lungs. "But after everything," he continued, his gaze softening, "I realized forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about not letting it chain you anymore." Caroline broke into sobs, deep, ragged ones, like a dam finally giving way. Lucas stepped a little closer. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. His presence was enough, a silent shelter for her grief. "My brother," Lucas said quietly, his eyes distant. "He had good moments, I know, but the darker parts of him, they won." Caroline nodded through her tears. "And us," Lucas added, voice as steady as the earth beneath their feet. "We're just the ones left behind, trying to walk forward with whatever pieces we have left." Silence wrapped around them, not suffocating, but almost like a thin, worn blanket, allowing their wounds to breathe. After a while, Caroline wiped her face, her breathing steadier. "Maisie and Willa," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They don't know any of this. I don't want them growing up burdened by the past." Lucas nodded. "I don't either." A fragile smile broke across Caroline's tear-streaked face. Not perfect, but real. "Then let's start over," she said. "Not for us. For them." Lucas studied her for a long moment. He no longer saw the woman who had hurt him. He saw a mother, fighting to protect the little light still left. And maybe, he realized, so was he. "Tomorrow," Caroline hesitated, "we're having a small gathering. A few friends. Family. A celebration for Maisie and Willa, for their recovery. I'd like you to come." Lucas felt something warm rise up inside him, something thawing deep within the frozen parts of his chest. "You don't have to answer now," Caroline rushed to say, afraid he'd retreat. "Just know, if you want to come, the door is open." She stepped back, giving him the space to choose. Lucas watched as she disappeared behind the gleaming Rolls-Royce, watched it turn down the rutted road and vanish. He unfolded the childish drawing once more. The crayon figures, clumsy but full of heart. "To Fire Hands, our hero. Love, Maisie and Willa." He read the words again, a lump forming in his throat. Maybe children saw what adults forgot. Maybe forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It was learning to walk forward, carrying the scars, but no longer letting them define you. Lucas pressed the drawing gently against his chest. For the first time in years, he felt himself truly breathing, not shackled by anger, not weighed down by regret, just standing quietly at the edge of something new, something still unwritten, but blazing with possibility. That afternoon, as the sun leaned heavily toward the west, Lucas Hart parked his truck along the cobblestone road in front of the ivy-covered house. He sat inside for a few extra minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel, heart swirling with a tangled mess of nerves, hesitation, and the faintest flicker of hope. Caroline Rhodes's home wasn't the grand estate he had once imagined. It was an old, warm house with wildflowers blooming around the porch and big windows draped with sheer white curtains that fluttered gently in the breeze. A house for people trying to heal. Lucas drew a deep breath, then opened the truck door. Caroline was waiting on the porch, wearing a simple, pale, blue sweater dress. No makeup, no glittering facade. Just Caroline, honest, weary, and with a flicker of fragile hope in her eyes when she saw him. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft as the wind. Lucas nodded. No grand speeches needed. Caroline opened the door wider, inviting him inside. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and fresh-baked bread, the kind of warm, grounding scent that made your chest unclench without even realizing. Family photos lined the walls. Ella and Sophie dressed up in silly costumes, crayon drawings taped proudly to the fridge, traces of a home stitching itself back together. Tiny footsteps pattered down the hallway. "Mommy, is he here?" A small voice called out, half excited, half shy. Caroline smiled. "Come say hello, sweethearts." Ella appeared first, her bright eyes shining, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to her chest. Sophie peeked out from behind her sister, her big brown eyes filled with curiosity and just a hint of nervousness. Lucas knelt down to their level. "Hey there," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle for a man more accustomed to engines and dust. Ella bit her lip, gathering courage, and stepped closer. "Are you the fire hands man?" she asked, wide-eyed. Lucas gave a small, bittersweet smile. "Maybe," he answered, extending his hand. "I'm Lucas." Ella reached out and touched his rough, calloused hand, her fingers feather-light. Sophie inched closer too, clinging to her sister. "Did it hurt?" she asked, eyes drifting toward the faint scars on Lucas's wrist. Lucas glanced at his hands, then back at them. "A little," he said honestly, "but saving you two made it worth it." The girls exchanged a look, then suddenly flung themselves into his arms, hugging him tightly around the neck as if afraid he'd vanish. Lucas froze for a moment. Then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around them. Something inside him, something frozen solid for years, cracked open just a little. Not to let pain seep out, but to let the light in. Caroline stood in the doorway, hands trembling slightly, eyes brimming. No word were needed. No explanations. This was the beginning. That night, Caroline cooked a simple meal: stew, mashed potatoes, and toasted bread. The girls clung to Lucas like baby birds finding their way home. "Tell us a story," Ella pleaded once they were gathered around the dinner table. Lucas glanced at Caroline, silently asking permission. She nodded, her eyes encouraging. He thought for a moment, then told them about how he and Asher, back when they were boys, had built forts in the woods and gone on wild, imaginary adventures through fields of golden grass. Ella and Sophie listened wide-eyed, giggling when Lucas exaggerated how Asher once fell face-first into a mud puddle and shrieked like a cat. Caroline watched silently. She understood. Lucas was sharing the good parts, the bright memories with her daughters. Not hiding the truth, but choosing to pass along the pieces of Asher that were still worth remembering. After dinner, Caroline brewed tea while Lucas helped clear the dishes, and the girls sprawled on the living room floor, setting up a Monopoly game. "When we lost Asher," Caroline said softly as they stood side by side at the sink, "I thought I'd never be able to let anyone into our lives again." Lucas dried the last plate and leaned casually against the counter. "No need to rush," he said. "No need to have all the answers." She gave a soft, shaky laugh. "I spent so many years trying to control everything, and then one snowy night, you showed up carrying my world in your arms." Lucas wiped his hands on a towel, his voice almost a whisper. "They saved me more than I saved them." Caroline looked up at him, her gaze steady and luminous. Gratitude, hope, trust. When Lucas got ready to leave, Ella and Sophie clung to him once more. "Will you come back?" Ella asked, voice trembling slightly. Lucas crouched down, meeting her gaze straight on. "If you want me to," he said firmly. Caroline stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You'll always have a place here," she whispered. Lucas left the house that night under a sky blanketed with stars. But inside him, for the first time in years, a small, steady flame was burning. Something that looked a little like family. Something that felt a lot like beginning again. News spread like wildfire. In a small town like Fair Hollow, where everyone knew each other through 3 generations, and every event was retold endlessly in diners and Sunday churches, the story of Lucas Hart, the quiet mechanic who had saved 2 little girls from a burning school bus in the middle of a snowstorm, became the talk of the entire community overnight. At first, it was just surprised glances at the grocery store. Then, whispers at church. And soon, an idea blossomed. We should do something for him. One Saturday morning, while Lucas was changing the oil on an old pickup, Mr. Jenkins, the town council chairman, appeared at the garage door. "Lucas," the old man rasped, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. Got a little something to discuss. Lucas wiped his hands on an oily rag and nodded. We, the town, really, Jenkins stammered. We want to hold a little ceremony. Just to say thank you. Lucas froze. Not necessary, he replied immediately. I didn't do it for recognition. Jenkins gave a tired smile, the kind of smile worn by men who had lived long enough to know that not everything was about the individual. We know that. But sometimes, saving not just a life, but the faith of a whole town, that's worth remembering. Lucas looked down at his calloused hands. There was a long silence. Then he exhaled. If it helps them, he said quietly, then I'll come. The day of the ceremony, the sky was a brilliant, breathless blue, as if even winter itself was holding its breath in respect. Fair Hollow Town Hall, a humble red-brick building with a weather clock tower, was adorned with flags and white streamers. People poured in from every corner of the county, old faces, faded memories. Some who had once looked away when passing Lucas on the street. Some who had doubted him when he had spoken the truth about his brother, Mason Hart, all those years ago. Today, they sat silently in the hall, carrying something heavier than excitement, regret. Lucas stood behind the curtain, quiet. He wore a white button-down shirt Caroline had carefully ironed the night before and a faded gray jacket, the best he owned. Caroline appeared, with Ella and Sophie at her side, dressed in cream-colored dresses, each holding wildflower bouquets. We picked them ourselves. Sophie beamed, thrusting the flowers into Lucas's hands. He knelt down and took the bouquet. They're beautiful, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Caroline placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. We're proud of you, she said, no embellishment needed. Ella, Sophie, and Caroline, the only reasons he had the strength to step onto that stage. The speakers crackled. Please welcome Lucas Hart, Mr. Jenkins announced, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. Lucas stepped out. The hall fell completely silent. Hundreds of eyes locked onto him. He wasn't the kind of man built for stages. His steps were heavy, heart-pounding, but then he saw Caroline smiling in the front row, Ella waving shyly, Sophie whispering fire hands with wide, sparkling eyes. He stood at the microphone, inhaled deeply. I don't know the right words, he began, his voice low but steady. I just knew there were two kids who needed saving. He paused, scanning the crowd. I don't think of myself as a hero. I just believe, if someone needs help, and you can help, you do it. A ripple of emotion stirred through the audience. Lucas paused, not because he lacked words, but because he was letting the feelings settle. He gripped the wooden podium a little tighter. I used to feel invisible here, he continued, slower now. Used to think my past had nailed my name to a dark corner. But sometimes, he said, voice catching slightly, the biggest fires don't destroy. They reveal. He fell silent, and the hall erupted in a wave of applause. Not hollow praise, but apology, acknowledgement, forgiveness. After the ceremony, the townspeople lined up. Some shook his hand, some wiped tears secretly, some could only whisper, I'm sorry. Lucas accepted each gesture, without judgment, without bitterness. He was no longer the man burdened by shadows of the past. He was the man who had walked through fire and still chose kindness. That night, Lucas sat on the steps outside his garage, the wildflower bouquet beside him, the moon pouring silver light across the dew-wet ground. Caroline came out, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and settled down beside him. The girls are asleep, she murmured. Lucas smiled faintly. They talked about you, Caroline continued, her voice soft. Ella said, when she grows up, she wants to save people, just like you. Lucas sat quietly for a long moment, a silence that didn't need to be filled. Do you know, Caroline said gently, today you didn't just save 2 children. Lucas turned his head, his eyes dark under the moonlight. You save yourself too, she whispered. And for the first time in years, Lucas Hart didn't argue. He simply nodded, his fingertips brushing the rim of his mug. Beside him, Caroline rested her head on his shoulder. Behind them lay the shadows of the past. Ahead of them, a new road, wide and open, full of light. The night in Fair Hollow was eerily quiet. The wind whispered through the old pine trees, and the moon floated high above, casting a thin layer of silver over the small street where Lucas Hart lived, where the darkness no longer felt as heavy as it once did. Lucas sat alone in his living room, the soft yellow light from a worn table lamp forming a small circle of warmth. On the table sat an old wooden box, silent and unassuming. Dust clung to its lid, the small scratches across its surface a map of years gone by. He had found it that afternoon while cleaning out the old cabinet in the workshop, something he had put off for far too long. Inside the box was a messy collection, fragments of a life once lived, a faded photo of two grinning brothers beside their first repaired pickup truck, an American flag keychain, a few worn playing cards, and letters. They were bundled together with a thin piece of twine. The paper yellowed, the handwriting strong but smudged in places, perhaps from tears or damp nights when Lucas had fought battles within himself. He ran his fingertips over the twine. Mason, the brother who had once been his whole world. The brother who had betrayed that trust in ways Lucas had never thought possible. Lucas didn't open the letters immediately. Instead, he made himself a cup of tea, a habit he had picked up from June, the old neighbor who used to say, "Sometimes a hot cup of tea can soften a hard heart." When the kettle began to whistle softly, Lucas returned to the table, carefully undoing the knot. The first letter began simply, "Mason, I miss you." Lucas skimmed through it. Lines poured out in anger, heartbreak, emotions he hadn't been able to voice at the time, because if he had, they would have swallowed him whole. Some letters were written in fury. "Why did you let it happen?" Some in loneliness. "I wish just once you would have stood for what was right." And some in a love that had never fully died. "No matter what, you're still my brother." Lucas sat there, reading each letter like tracing the scars etched into his own heart. Every word, every line, was a step closer to confronting the past he had long buried. By the time the clock neared midnight, there was a knock at the door. He didn't need a look. He knew who it was. Caroline Rhodes, the woman who carried pieces of the same broken story. She stepped inside, her dark wool coat dusted lightly with frost. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted softly. Lucas simply nodded, motioning her in. Without speaking, Caroline noticed the change in the room. The table lamp, the cup of tea, the scattered letters across the wooden table. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice tender but cautious. Lucas pushed the bundle toward her. "Letters," he said quietly. "Ones I wrote to Mason, but never sent." Caroline looked at him, then down at the fragile stack. "You never meant for anyone to read them," she said, more as a realization than a question. Lucas shook his head. "They were the things I could never say aloud. Until now." Caroline sat down. Slowly, the warm light bathed her features, no longer youthful, but resilient and real. "Do you want me to read them?" she asked. Lucas hesitated. Part of him wanted to bury them again, lock them away. But another part, the part that had carried two children from a burning bus, the part that had stood up before the town, knew it was time. He nodded. Caroline opened the first letter. The soft rustle of paper filled the room. She read slowly. Her eyes moved carefully across each shaky, earnest line. By the third letter, her hand trembled. By the fifth, a tear slid down her cheek. Lucas said nothing. He sat rigid, hands gripping the arms of the chair, as she finished reading and gently laid the letters back on the table. "You loved Mason so much," she whispered, as if seeing a whole landscape she had only glimpsed in fragments before. "And I grieve him just as much," Lucas answered. In that moment, they weren't just talking about the letters. They were speaking about the loss, the layered wounds they had never dared to face. Caroline reached out, wrapping her hand around his. "Let me keep them," she said, her voice firm yet full of tenderness. "Not to trap you in the past, but so I can learn to forgive, too, for Mason and for myself." Lucas looked at her for a long time. Then, without a word, he let go, letting the letters fall into the embrace of trust, the way one hands over a piece of their soul, believing it will not be broken again. That night, Lucas stood by the window, gazing out. Snow had begun to fall softly. Not a blizzard this time, but gentle flakes, quiet as whispered apologies. Beside him, Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder. She didn't say anything more, and neither did he, because sometimes forgiveness doesn't come with grand speeches. It comes with quiet moments when two broken people choose to rebuild, not with declarations, but with understanding, with trust, with the old letters that no longer felt like chains, but proof that even after all the wrongs, we can still choose love. A Sunday morning, and sunlight burst through the dew-soaked trees, spilling gold across the small front yard where Lucas Hart had lived alone for so many years. But today, everything was different. Children's laughter echoed from the backyard. The dog barked wildly as it chased after bouncing balls, and the smell of fresh-baked pastries drifted from the tiny kitchen, creating a warm kind of music Lucas had once believed he would never hear again. He leaned against the kitchen doorway, a coffee cup cooling in his hand, but his heart glowing with something unfamiliar, and yet somehow known, a feeling of belonging. Caroline was kneeling on the lawn, sleeves rolled up, laughing as she helped Ella tie her shoelaces. Sophie was hard at work, trying to build a fort out of old cardboard boxes Lucas had hauled out from the shed. "Hire Uncle Lucas!" Sophie shouted, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes sparkling. Lucas chuckled and picked up another box, his hands calloused but gentle. "At your command, Princess," he answered with mock seriousness. The girls erupted into laughter. Caroline looked up at him then. Her gaze carried silent gratitude. No words needed, just a look. In that moment, Lucas understood. He was no longer a lonely mechanic surviving through silent days. He was becoming part of something bigger, a family. That afternoon, after Ella and Sophie had collapsed onto the couch from the sheer excitement of their fort battle, Lucas and Caroline sat together on the front porch steps. The air was saturated with a rare, tender peace. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the quiet whispers of time. Caroline wrapped a thin blanket around her shoulders, staring dreamily toward the horizon. "You know," she said after a long silence, "it's been so long since I felt this peaceful." Lucas simply nodded. Peace, he thought, more precious than fame, more valuable than money, something he had only dared to remember in his dreams. He glanced sideways at her. Caroline no longer looked like the woman he'd first met, tired, anxious, withdrawn. She had changed, softer, braver, and she and the girls had pieced his broken soul back together in a way that no apology ever could. The next day, they decided to do something simple, fix up the backyard garden. It was nothing grand, but to Lucas, it felt like a ceremony, laying down the foundations of their new future. All four of them, Lucas, Caroline, Ella, and Sophie, worked side by side, turning soil, planting lavender bushes, hammering stakes for the tomato vines. Every handful of earth, every burst of laughter, every drop of sweat stitched them closer together. Sometimes Ella clumsily spilled a whole pot of dirt onto her shoes. Sophie, meanwhile, was on a mission to rescue every earthworm she found. Caroline laughed, and Lucas could only shake his head, smiling wide. Never had these small, messy moments felt so precious. It didn't have to be perfect. It only needed to be together. That evening, with sore fingers and hair smelling of damp earth, they gathered around the tiny kitchen table. Lucas grilled cheese, the only dish he'd ever learned from his mother, while Caroline stirred a pot of sweet corn soup. Ella and Sophie took charge of dessert, which mostly involved arranging cookies into star shapes on a plate. After dinner, they played a storytelling game, where each person had to add a new part to the tale. Sophie began with a princess riding a tractor. Ella added a flying dog. Caroline wove in a magical garden. And Lucas, after a moment of hesitation, softly said, "And a kind mechanic who fixed the broken heart of the whole kingdom." The table fell silent, not from awkwardness, but because they all felt the weight behind those simple words. Caroline smiled and reached under the table to squeeze Lucas's hand. No words needed, no grand gestures, just that quiet, steady presence, enough. Later that night, after Caroline had tucked the girls into bed, Lucas sat alone on the porch. The porch light glowed soft and golden. Crickets chirped somewhere in the distance. The night breeze was gentle, like a lullaby. He thought of all the losses, of Mason, of the long, barren years he'd spent merely surviving, not living. He had once believed his heart was shut forever. But now, every breath he took was filled with the images of Ella, Sophie, and Caroline. Family, not by blood, but by choice, by deciding every day to stay, to forgive, to love, by rebuilding a home from the wreckage of the past. The next morning, Ella and Sophie burst into Lucas's room. "Uncle Lucas, you have to come with us." Ella panted. "Where?" Lucas rubbed his eyes, his voice gravelly. "To plant a dream tree." Sophie beamed. They tugged him outside to the yard, where Caroline had prepared a small patch of soil, 2 tiny saplings, and a handmade sign in crayon letters. Dream Corner. Caroline smiled and waved. Lucas knelt down. The girls placed a delicate little sapling into his hand. "You plant this one for your wish, Uncle," Ella said. Lucas swallowed hard. He looked over at Caroline. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears, yet bright with hope. He drew a deep breath, dug a small hole, and gently placed the sapling inside. "What's your wish, Uncle?" Sophie asked eagerly. Lucas covered the roots with trembling hands, then lifted his gaze. His voice was steady but full of emotion. "To keep the ones I love. Forever," he said. Caroline slipped her hand into his and squeezed. And in that moment, surrounded by sunlight, laughter, and the sweet, rich scent of the earth, Lucas understood. Family isn't something you're born into. Family is the people you choose to trust, to forgive, to love with a heart that once knew what it meant to be broken. That afternoon, the sky over Fair Hollow was draped in a thin gray veil, like an old quilt stretched across the heavens. Lucas' heart leaned against the backyard's wooden fence, his flannel shirt damp with mist. He was repairing a piece of the arbor that the wind had torn loose during yesterday's sudden rain. Not a fierce storm, but a slow, steady downpour, as if the sky itself was sighing. He was used to the loneliness of rain. It had once been his companion through cold evenings and old, relentless thoughts. But today the soft patter of rain on the tin roof carried a different rhythm, the rhythm of something about to change. Caroline Rhodes appeared at the back door. She carried no umbrella. Her dark gray knit dress clung to her small frame, soaked through. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks in dripping strands. Yet she smiled. A smile so fragile, yet so radiant. It was as if she had stepped straight out of the most beautiful memory Lucas had ever lost. Lucas stared at her, forgetting the rain, forgetting the broken wood scattered at his feet. "You'll catch a cold," he murmured, his voice rough with rain and something deeper. Caroline didn't answer. She walked slowly toward him, her eyes glowing with a depth that couldn't be denied. When she was just a few steps away, she paused and slipped her hand in her coat pocket. Lucas saw her hand tremble, not from the cold, but from something much larger weighing on her heart. She pulled out a small, worn box. Not the polished velvet kind you'd find in jewelry stores. Just a simple wooden box, faded and scratched at the corners. "Lucas," Caroline said, her voice shaking but steady. "I once thought I didn't have the courage to love again." The rain fell between them, slowing every breath. "But then you came." She swallowed hard. "Not like the ones who promised to protect me and left. Not like the ones who came and disappeared." Lucas clenched his fists. His vision blurred, from the rain or something else, he couldn't tell. Caroline opened the box. Inside was a plain gold ring, old and simple. "This was my grandmother's ring," she whispered. "She told me, don't give it to the one who makes your heart race. Give it to the one who makes you want to stay." Caroline lifted her gaze. "Lucas Hart, if I ask first, would you say yes?" Silence. Only the rain tapping out a steady rhythm on the roof. Lucas stepped forward. Slowly, he crouched down, shielding her hand with his to keep the raindrops from falling on the ring. His eyes searched hers, for truth, for promises, for the kind of courage he never thought he still had. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Caroline laughed through the rain. a laugh so drenched and beautiful it made Lucas bite his lip to keep from sobbing like a boy. "More sure than anything in my life," she answered. Lucas didn't immediately take the ring. He pulled Caroline into his arms, holding her tightly. The rain seeped cold into his skin, but her embrace was warm, steady, softening the whole world around him. "I have nothing to offer you," he whispered into her ear. "No fortune, no fancy words, just a heart that once broke, and now is learning how to beat again because of you." Caroline pulled back, her eyes red but shining. "That's enough," she said, and with a clumsy but heartfelt motion, she slipped the heirloom ring onto the fourth finger of his left hand. It was a little tight, as if it, too, needed a moment to believe it had finally found its home. That night, they sat on the porch wrapped in a single big blanket. Lucas brewed coffee, the only thing he knew how to make well. Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder, no more words needed. In the distance, Ella and Sophie played under the porch light, their giggles bursting like little firecrackers every time the puddles splashed. "Should we have a real ceremony?" Caroline asked softly. Lucas shrugged, half teasing. "You want a church, a choir, or just a few logs for a fire?" Caroline giggled. "Just the people who truly wish us well." Lucas looked out at the backyard, where two little angels were running in circles, waving wildflowers in their tiny fists. He nodded. "Then right here," he whispered. 1 week later, under a sky so blue it seemed painted, they held a wedding in the backyard. No fancy wedding dress, no grand orchestra, just Ella and Sophie in simple white dresses, hair threaded with daisies, solemnly carrying flower baskets. There was June, the elderly neighbor, reading a poem she wrote by hand. And there were the townsfolk of Fair Hollow, the ones who once gossiped behind Lucas's back, now standing quietly, hand in hand, their eyes glistening. Lucas wore a plain white shirt, faded jeans, and worn boots. Caroline wore an ivory knit dress, simple, graceful, like sunlight breaking through the mist. When they exchanged vows, Caroline gripped his hand tightly. "We're not from a fairy tale," she whispered. "We're from the scars, and it's the scars that taught us how to love." Lucas nodded, finding no words better than the steady thump of his heart, now beating in time with hers. That night, after the guests had gone, after the last daisies had fallen to the porch steps, Lucas and Caroline sat on the stoop, hand in hand, gazing at the starry sky. No fireworks, no champagne, just the presence of each other, just the quiet knowing that after all the losses, all the mistakes, all the nameless years of waiting, they had found what everyone searches for, someone to walk the rest of the way with. No grand fanfare, no show, just simply together. That year, autumn arrived slowly, as if the whole town of Fair Hollow was trying to stretch out the warm days just a little longer. Lucas Hart sat on the front steps of his little house, a flannel shirt draped loosely over his shoulder, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. In front of him, Caroline Rhodes was arranging flowers in a chipped porcelain vase, the one Ella and Sophie had insisted on picking at the weekend flea market. The late afternoon sun poured gold through the maple trees, scattering shimmering specks of light across Caroline's loose hair. Lucas couldn't remember the last time he sat still like this, just to watch a moment of peace drift by. Maybe before the biting winters of lonely years. Maybe before he had to teach himself that peace was nothing but an extravagant illusion. But today, here, with children's laughter echoing from the backyard and Caroline's silhouette tilted against the sunset, he believed peace was real. That evening, the little house was full of noise and life. Ella and Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, arguing over their super-secret Halloween plans. Caroline baked cookies, occasionally glancing over and winking at Lucas. He was trying to patch up Sophie's favorite doll, the one that had lost a leg in a fierce battle with a neighbor's dog. "Mom, Lucas is better at fixing things than Superman," Ella shouted. Lucas laughed, holding up the awkwardly stitched doll. "Hey, I'm only good at fixing things that stay still," he joked. Caroline brought out a tray of cookies, filling the room with the sweet smell of butter and cinnamon. "You're fixing more than that, you know," she said lightly, but her words made Lucas turn away to hide his bashful smile. The days flowed by like a gentle river. Lucas fixed everything: the broken gate, the leaking roof, the old porch swing. Caroline planted more roses, taught the girls how to garden, and embroidered little kitchen cloths. They learned how to rake autumn leaves together, to wake up at 5 a.m., just to catch the sunrise, to argue about who left the faucet running all night. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when Lucas sat frozen, when even a small noise could make his heart race. Old ghosts from darker days not entirely gone. There were nights Caroline quietly wiped tears away, staring at an old flannel shirt that used to belong to someone she had lost. But they didn't avoid the pain. They learned to walk through it. Together. One rainy Sunday afternoon, Caroline suggested, "Let's paint the living room." Lucas frowned. What did that poor wall ever do to deserve punishment? Caroline giggled. "I just want a fresh start. A new color. New memories." So they painted. A soft, buttery yellow. Not perfect. There were streaks on the floor, Ella's handprint smudged near the window, Sophie secretly doodling a tiny heart near the baseboard. Lucas almost grumbled, but when he looked at their beaming faces, he understood. Sometimes happiness isn't about making things perfect. It's about embracing the messy fingerprints and the crooked brushstrokes, the tiny chapters of a story being written together. That night, the whole family huddled in the living room, still heavy with the scent of paint. Caroline leaned her head on Lucas's shoulder. Ella and Sophie curled up in blankets, half watching cartoons, half spinning wild tales about school, friends, and the enormous secrets of 7-year-old life. Lucas listened, nodding seriously, as if attending a high-level summit. Caroline whispered to him, "Do you see it?" "See what?" "Us." Lucas looked around. Little shoes scattered everywhere. A coffee table smudged with tiny handprints. A freshly painted, imperfect wall. A fire crackling gently in the stove. A woman he loved, smiling at him as if he were the very sky she was gazing at. And 2 little girls, not connected to him by blood, no legal ties, yet loving him with absolute trust. Lucas nodded. "I see it." Caroline squeezed his hand. "Then don't ever forget." There were still nights when Lucas woke up with a start. Memories of fire, of angry voices, of hands letting go. But now, when he reached out in the dark, there was always a tiny hand, Ella's or Sophie's, or Caroline's gentle touch. A single touch, a shared breath, a soft whisper, "I'm here," enough to pull him back. Enough to remind him that no matter how harsh the past had been, it could no longer steal what he had now. Not ever again. One late afternoon, with the sun dipping behind the hills and painting the sky in blazing shades of orange, Lucas stood on the porch, looking out over his little world. Caroline was sweeping the front yard, her hair fluttering like golden threads in the breeze. Ella was teaching Sophie how to ride a bike, their laughter soaring into the evening air. And Lucas realized, happiness isn't something you find. It's something you build. From the cracks, from the scars, from imperfect hands reaching for each other and never letting go. Happiness, he understood, isn't about forgetting pain. It's about loving enough that the pain grows smaller, softer, until there's room only for the light. And in that moment, surrounded by the glow of the sunset and the sound of children's laughter, Lucas' heart knew he had found home. Not a place, but people, hugs, the joyful calls of Daddy Lucas echoing deep inside him. A family, a life, a new definition of happiness, simple, genuine, and lasting, just like the heart beating steady and whole inside his chest. That morning, the town of Fair Hollow lay under a thin veil of mist. Lucas' heart woke up earlier than usual. He stood by the kitchen sink, holding a warm cup of coffee, his gaze drifting lazily toward the backyard. Dew glistened on the trees, and the first shards of sunlight pierced through the hazy fog. It was a scene so peaceful it felt almost unreal. But inside Lucas, emotions were rising like an unseen tide. Today marked the anniversary of the fire, the day everything shattered, and the day everything quietly began again. No one had planned a memorial. No banners, no speeches, just people quietly remembering, each in their own way. Lucas took a deep breath and let out a heavy sigh. He didn't want to live forever under the shadow of that day. He wanted something different. Not pain, but hope. In the small kitchen, Caroline Rhodes was bustling around, preparing breakfast. She wore a soft, cream-colored sweater, her hair tied up in a messy bun, a few strands falling across her forehead. Ella and Sophie sat at the kitchen table, carefully scribbling on pieces of cardboard. "Thank you for staying." Lucas stepped closer and read over their shoulders. "What's this for, little ladies?" Sophie looked up, grinning wide. "For Daddy," she chirped. Lucas chuckled, but his chest tightened. It had been a long, long time since anyone had called him by a name so full of love. Caroline approached, holding another handmade card. "We thought," she said gently, "instead of remembering the fire, we could throw a little party to celebrate everything we've overcome." Lucas looked at the three of them, his family, united in this quiet act of love. He felt his throat burn. He didn't say anything, just nodded, slowly, but firmly. That afternoon, their little house transformed into a colorful art studio. Ella and Sophie taped up paper decorations and tied balloons all around the living room. Caroline baked cinnamon cookies, sneaking one to Lucas now and then with a mischievous smile. Outside, Lucas repaired last year's string lights, each tiny bulb twinkling like a little star. As he looked around, at the imperfect, jumbled, joyful chaos, Lucas understood. You don't have to forget the past. You just have to learn how to live alongside it, turning cracks into places where the light can shine through. By evening, close friends had gathered in the backyard. There were no solemn speeches, just laughter, stories, and the clinking of cups. Lucas stood back for a moment, taking it all in. There was June, the elderly neighbor who always brought over hearty soups and sharp advice. There was Mr. Miller from the auto shop, who once doubted him, now silently offering a battered pocket watch as a quiet apology. And most importantly, there were Caroline, Ella, and Sophie, the family Lucas never imagined he could belong to. Caroline approached, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. She handed him one, her eyes soft and steady. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Lucas paused, then answered, "I think, for the first time in a long time, I really am." No long explanation needed. They both understood. Being okay didn't mean forgetting the pain. It meant looking at the losses, the mistakes, and still daring to love life again. As the evening wound down, Caroline pulled Lucas toward the middle of the yard, where paper lanterns swayed gently in the night breeze. She handed him a piece of paper and a pen. "Write down something you want to let go of," she whispered. Lucas held the pen, hesitating. Images flashed through his mind. His late brother's face, long nights haunted by regret, the harsh self-blame he had carried for years. Finally, he wrote just 3 simple words. "Old burdens." He folded the paper and tucked it into one of the lanterns. Beside him, Caroline did the same. The girls bounced excitedly around them, their eyes bright with wonder. When everyone was ready, Lucas lit the small flame inside his lantern. It swelled gently, growing warmer, and together, they released the lanterns into the night sky. Softly, silently, the tiny glowing lights floated upward, drifting toward the stars, carrying away old grief, carrying away old mistakes, carrying quiet promises of a future no longer chained to the past. Lucas watched until his lantern became a mere pinprick against the endless sky. Beside him, Caroline squeezed his hand tightly. Ella and Sophie clung to his arms, whispering, "Can we do it again at Christmas?" Lucas bent down, pulling them into a warm hug. "We can do it as many times as we want," he murmured, "as long as we're together." Caroline looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the lantern light. "As long as we're together," she echoed. And Lucas' heart, who once believed he was just a lonely mechanic, realized he had found something far greater than success. A family, a home, a hope that had blossomed from brokenness. That night, when the house had gone quiet, Lucas stood by the window, watching the first snowflakes begin to fall. No more loneliness squeezing his chest. No more memories clawing at his soul. only the soft hush of snow blanketing the porch, like a silent blessing from the sky. He smiled to himself, so softly it barely moved his lips, and he whispered, "I don't need a perfect past. I just need the courage to reach for the hand that's reaching back." Then he turned and walked back toward the bedroom where Caroline and the girls were fast asleep, where the future was waiting gently, patiently, where life, finally, was smiling back. On a late autumn morning, the town of Fair Hollow was bathed in a dreamy golden sunlight, as soft as the first memories of winter. Lucas Hart carefully loaded homemade cookie boxes into the back of his old pickup truck. Inside the house, Caroline was tying little ribbons on his simple gift baskets, gifts they planned to deliver to every home in town. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. Lucas looked up, his face as steady as ever. "Never been more sure," he said. This wasn't anyone's idea, but Ella and Sophie's. One evening, after hearing old stories about Fair Hollow from their grandfather, the girls had quietly asked, "You saved us, Dad, but who's going to save the grown-ups who hurt you?" Lucas had just chuckled then, ruffling their hair. But that night, he couldn't sleep. Fair Hollow wasn't a big town, but the distrust that had once bloomed here ran deep, like hidden cracks in the earth. Years ago, when Lucas tried to expose the truth about his late brother, about the wrongs no one wanted to admit, the whole town turned its back on him. Not because they hated him, but because they couldn't bear to lose the perfect image they had clung to for so long. Lucas had forgiven them quietly, but he had never truly reopened his heart. Until now. The pickup truck rolled to a stop in front of the town's church, the heart of Fair Hollow. Caroline and the girls hopped down first, carrying the small gift baskets. Lucas followed slowly behind, feeling as if he were carrying both his past and his future on his shoulders. When the church doors swung open, the scent of old wood and warm light spilled out. Inside were familiar faces. Faces that once turned away. Faces that once whispered. Faces that once stayed silent, and now stood there, waiting. Lucas walked forward, placing the baskets on a long table in the center of the hall. A heavy, wordless silence hung in the air, but it was no longer cold. Ella shyly pushed Lucas forward, her eyes sparkling with innocence and trust. "Daddy wants to say something," she mumbled. Lucas took a deep breath. The eyes that watched him, no longer like stones, but like doors cracked slightly open. He knew an apology would never be enough. And he didn't know them one. But some things needed to be said, not because others demanded it, but because he needed to let them go. "Not all of us are proud of our past," Lucas began, his voice low and steady beneath the church's arched ceiling. "We make mistakes. We believe in what's easy to believe. We fear facing the truth because we think it will take away the things we love most." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the room. "That day when I spoke out about what I knew, I lost my family, my standing, and the trust of the town I grew up in. But what I never lost was my belief that the truth, even when painful, is always better than a comfortable lie." Caroline stood silently behind him, her eyes shimmering with tears. Ella and Sophie clutched each other's hands a little tighter. Lucas continued, "I'm not standing here today to demand anything. I just want you to know forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is accepting that we all have failed at some point, and still choosing to believe that we are worthy of moving forward." A soft breeze from a cracked window stirred the old church curtains. A long, aching silence followed. Then, the sound of chairs scraping back. Mr. Howard, the hardware store owner who once refused to sell to Lucas, stood up. He walked forward, rough hands extended. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we know it." Lucas looked at that hand, not just an apology, but a bridge. He reached out and took it. The handshake was firm, steady. A smattering of applause broke out. Not loud, not grand, but enough to fill the invisible cracks that had divided them for so long. That day, Fair Hollow didn't change overnight. No one forgot what had happened. But something new began. Gift baskets were passed around. Awkward conversations turned into tentative smiles. Avoided glances turned into nods and greetings. Lucas sat on the church steps beside Caroline. Ella and Sophie chased each other across the lawn with other children. "You did it," Caroline whispered. Lucas shook his head slightly. "We did," he said. And in his heart, for the first time in years, there was no heaviness. Only something light, clear, a faith reborn, a truly new beginning. That night, after they returned home, Lucas stood at the living room window, watching the town's twinkling lights. Caroline approached from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Lucas thought for a moment. "No," he said. "The things we lost may never come back. But what we're building, what we're protecting, is worth more than anything we ever lost." Caroline smiled, wrapping her arms tighter around him. "I think so, too," she whispered. Lucas turned to her, his eyes tender and steady. He didn't need the town's forgiveness. He only needed to know that, in the end, he hadn't given up. He had loved, he had fought, he had forgiven, and he had found his way back to himself. Fair Hollow was no longer just a place filled with painful memories. It had become part of hope, part of family, part of home. The first winter, when Lucas' heart truly opened his heart to Fair Hollow, was also the season when the smallest miracles began to bloom around him. Not loudly, not spectacularly, just through simple, tender moments that touched the heart in ways words could never fully express. One Saturday afternoon, after a light snowfall, Lucas was sitting in the living room, repairing an old armchair. Caroline sat by the window reading, her hair falling softly like honey under the pale sunlight. Ella and Sophie were busy on the floor with colored paper, crayons, and scissors. They had been whispering and giggling together all morning. Lucas let his curiosity simmer, his hands steadily stitching the torn fabric, until the girls rushed over, wrapping their paint-smudged arms around him. "Daddy Lucas!" Ella squealed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Sophie and I made this for you." Lucas set down his tools and took the sheet of paper they shoved into his hands. Across it, drawn in clumsy but lively strokes, was a picture, a tall man with chestnut hair holding hands with two little girls in flower dresses, standing under a sky full of stars. Above it, in wobbly letters, they had written, "Our family." Lucas stared at it for a long moment. Something inside his chest unfurled, bloomed, and settled into a warm, steady ache. He glanced at Caroline. She just smiled at him, soft, steady, without saying a word. Ella scrambled into his lap, hugging his neck tightly. "You have to stick it on the fridge, next to the whale I drew last time," she insisted. Sophie nodded eagerly, her eyes shining. Lucas chuckled, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise." And so, in the glow of the late afternoon sun, a new family portrait was taped onto the fridge, a silent vow that old wounds could, indeed, heal, little by little. In the days that followed, signs of trust from the girls appeared more often, subtle but profound. For the first time, Sophie timidly curled into Lucas's lap during a movie, resting her small head against his chest. Lucas barely dared to breathe, afraid he might shatter the fragile moment. Another morning, while Lucas was repairing the backyard fence, Ella bustled over with a cup of hot cocoa she had made herself, spilling half of it down her front in the process. "You have to stay warm, Daddy," she declared firmly, like a tiny general. Lucas knelt down, accepting the cocoa, feeling not just the warmth in his hands, but in places he hadn't realized were still frozen inside him. Caroline watched all of this unfold, her eyes quiet and bright. Some nights, after the girls had fallen asleep, she and Lucas would sit by the fireplace, saying little, just holding hands, touching not just each other's skin, but each other's broken places, now slowly stitched together with patience and love. "Did you ever think," Caroline whispered one such night, "that we could find this? After everything?" Lucas squeezed her hand gently. "No," he answered honestly, "but I never stopped hoping." The firelight flickered in their eyes, like two small, stubborn stars. One Sunday morning, Fair Hollow's church held a winter festival for the children. Lucas, never fond of crowds, reluctantly agreed to come with Caroline and the girls. But when they arrived, with the grounds decked in ribbons, lanterns, and a towering Christmas tree. Something strange happened. People smiled at him. Genuinely. No more stiffness. No more avoiding eyes. Some even patted his shoulder as they passed. Small greetings that spoke louder than words. Ella and Sophie dragged him over to build a snowman. They placed an old hat on the snowman's head and giggled. "It looks like Daddy Lucas." Lucas laughed. A real, full, unguarded laugh, the kind he hadn't felt in years. And in that moment, beneath a sparkling winter sky, Lucas understood. Family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it's in the little hands clinging to yours. It's in the wobbly drawings taped proudly to your fridge. It's in unexpected hugs on sleepy afternoons. It's in a woman choosing to trust you again, even when the world once doubted you. Family is where you are forgiven and loved, unconditionally. That night, carrying a sleeping Ella to bed, Lucas paused. On her nightstand, next to a battered old teddy bear, was a small handmade card. In their clumsy handwriting, Ella and Sophie had written, "Thank you for staying, Daddy." Tears pricked Lucas's eyes. He bent down and kissed their foreheads gently, whispering, "I'm the one who should be thankful." Then he quietly turned off the light. The moonlight spilled through the window, casting a soft, silver glow across the floor, like a silent blessing. A reminder that tomorrow would come again. That even the tiniest hope, if held onto gently enough, could grow into an entire new life. And Lucas knew. He hadn't just found a family. He had found himself again. That winter morning, sunlight slipped through the tiny cracks of the window, casting thin, delicate beams across the worn wooden floor. In the small kitchen, filled with the smell of toasted bread and fresh coffee, Lucas' heart stood still for a moment, holding a chipped mug, taking in the scene before him. Ella was battling a spilled milk bottle, her arms flailing helplessly over the mess. Sophie, her hair a wild tangle, sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully coloring, not on paper, but on Lucky, the world's most patient golden retriever. Caroline stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, laughing so hard she could barely stay upright as she wiped up the chaos. And amid all the noise and disorder, Lucas realized he was standing in one of the most complete moments of his life. Not a perfect family, but a real one. After breakfast, Lucas fixed the back door hinge while Caroline helped the girls prepare for their Christmas recital at school. He could hear Sophie practicing an off-key jingle bells on her little keyboard, mixed with bursts of giggles as Ella tried to wrap Lucky in a red scarf like a superhero's cape. Everything was messy, loud, and wildly unorganized. And it was perfect, just like life. Never quite according to plan, but always full of unexpected treasures for those who paused long enough to notice. Lucas wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped inside, just in time to see Caroline laughing uncontrollably as Ella decided to wear a cooking pot as her Santa hat. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "Looks like the master chefs are preparing for a full-scale stage invasion," he teased. Ella declared proudly, "Daddy Lucas, art needs creativity." Sophie nodded earnestly, her eyes twinkling brighter than the Christmas lights. Caroline caught his gaze, her eyes filled with a light he hadn't seen in years, a light he once feared had been lost. "You see it, don't you?" she said softly. "We don't need a big house, just a roof full of love." Lucas stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her back, squeezing lightly. "I've spent my whole life looking for a place like this," he whispered. That afternoon, while the girls practiced with their classmates, Lucas and Caroline sat quietly in the living room. Caroline pulled an old cardboard box from under the bed. Inside were faded Christmas ornaments, a broken string of lights, and a few handmade crafts from years long gone. "These are the last things I brought from my old home," she whispered, her voice a blend of sadness and hope. Lucas crouched down, patiently replacing bulbs on the string lights, as if mending not just decorations, but old, fragile memories. Together, they hung the ornaments on the small tree in the corner. Caroline's hands trembled slightly as she placed a delicate glass ball etched with the name David, the name of her late husband. Lucas said nothing. He simply wrapped an arm around her, letting her lean into him. A long moment of silent gratitude filled the room. Gratitude for the losses, the mistakes, the crooked paths that somehow led them here, exactly where they were meant to be. The town's Christmas recital wasn't a grand event, but to Ella and Sophie, it was their whole universe. Lucas, bundled into a too-tight coat, waited in the church foyer with Caroline. The girls peeked out from behind the stage curtains, waving wildly. That bright, breathless excitement of childhood, standing in front of a crowd for the first time, singing a favorite song. When it was their class's turn, the audience erupted in supportive applause. Sophie missed half the notes, and Ella waved enthusiastically to the crowd at all the wrong moments, making Caroline double over in silent laughter. But Lucas stood still, hands tight at his sides, eyes stinging with pride. Not because they were perfect, but because they were brave enough to step onto that stage. Brave enough to sing out in all their beautiful, messy glory. It was the same lesson he, Caroline, and their little family were learning day by day. To live, to love, to trust again. On the drive home, in the rattling old pickup, the girls fell asleep in the back seat, their faces pressed together, mumbling the last lines of Silent Night in their dreams. Caroline pulled a blanket over them and turned to Lucas. "You know," she whispered, "there were days when I thought I had lost everything. But somehow, I found it all again. Here." Lucas reached for her hand, warm and steady. "You didn't lose anything," he said, his eyes focused on the dark road ahead. "You were just on your way to where you truly belong." Caroline rested her head on his shoulder, her heart quietly grateful for every rough road that had brought her to this place. When they pulled up to the little house, snowflakes drifted lazily through the night sky. Lucas carried each sleeping girl inside, cradling them like he was holding the entire world in his arms. He paused for a moment, watching them sleep. Sometimes that was enough, more than enough. When he returned to the living room, Caroline had lit the fireplace. She beckoned him with a smile, lifting the edge of a thick blanket, inviting him into the warm cocoon they had built together. Without hesitation, Lucas sat down, pulling her close, their breaths mingling in the soft glow of the fire. The flames danced along the old walls, lighting up two faces marked by past scars, now learning to trust in a peaceful tomorrow. No words were needed, because some things, like happiness, like family, don't have to be spoken. They just have to be lived, real, and whole. Cold winds swept through the bare trees of Fair Hollow, whispering. Through the narrow streets, lined with homes draped in Christmas lights. In the small wooden house, tucked away at the end of Willow Street, Lucas Hart sat on the front steps, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze far away. He spotted Caroline in the distance, wrapped in her old wool coat, her footsteps light as mist. But her eyes, those eyes, still carried the weight of things too heavy for words. Caroline sat down beside him without a greeting, without questions, just quietly, like two steady breaths finding each other in the winter chill. "I'm not always right," Lucas said softly, his voice low and rough like the wind brushing the old rooftop. Caroline turned, her gray eyes bright in the dim light. "And I'm not always wrong," she replied. They both chuckled, a low, quiet sound, an acknowledgement of old fractures no longer allowed to define them. In the days following the school Christmas performance, amid daily worries and scattered tender moments, Caroline and Lucas began their hardest journey yet, learning how to forgive. Not with grand speeches, not with tearful apologies, but with quiet patience, with hands squeezed together at sunset, with sitting side by side for hours without needing to say anything. They learned that forgiveness wasn't about wiping away mistakes. It was about learning to live with the memories, letting them exist without weighing down every step. One Sunday afternoon, Lucas invited Caroline outside to help fix the old swing under the ancient oak in the backyard. The seat was rotted, the ropes frayed by wind and rain. They knelt together, carefully replacing the rope, each knot tied, as if binding up the torn edges of their own hearts. When the swing was finally hung, Lucas gave it a gentle push, watching it sway in the crisp winter breeze. Caroline looked at him, her eyes softening. Do you remember the first time you ever sat on a swing as a kid? She asked. Lucas nodded. I remember being terrified of swinging too high. It felt like losing control was the worst thing that could happen. Caroline smiled lightly. I always closed my eyes and laughed. Because, in that moment, I believed I wouldn't fall. Lucas held her gaze for a long moment. I want to believe like that again, he said quietly. That night, after Ella and Sophie had fallen asleep, Lucas found Caroline standing alone on the porch, staring up at the stars. The world was silent, save for the soft murmur of the trees. He draped his sweater over her shoulders and stood beside her, both looking up. I'm scared, Caroline whispered. Lucas didn't ask what she was afraid of. He knew. Afraid to trust. Afraid to hope. Afraid to lose again. Fear is a good sign, he said gently. It means you're still trying. Caroline turned to him, and in her eyes, Lucas saw every scar she had hidden. Betrayal, disappointment, loss. I used to think, she whispered, that forgiveness meant accepting everything bad that happened. Lucas shook his head slowly. Forgiveness, he said, is just refusing to let it keep hurting you. A tear slid down Caroline's cheek. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was cleansing, freeing. Lucas brushed it away with his callous thumb. We don't have to forget, he said. We just have to let go. And under Fair Hollow's starry winter sky, they stood there, two battered souls learning how to release, not the past, but the bitterness. Not forgetting, but choosing to live on. The next day, Caroline mustered the courage to open an old drawer in her office, pulling out a stack of family photos from her past. She spread them across the table. There was her late husband, smiling in uniform. Images from a life she once thought was happiness. Lucas entered the room and saw her sitting among the memories. He said nothing, just pulled up a chair and sat across from her. Caroline picked up a photo, turning it over, where faded words still clung to the back. Forever. She placed the photo down and looked up at Lucas. You don't have to compete with ghosts, she said, her voice trembling. Lucas smiled sadly. I know. I don't love you because of who you were before, Caroline continued. I love you because you don't ask me to forget. Lucas nodded, his vision blurring. We're not here to replace anyone, he whispered. We're here to move forward. Together. Caroline reached across the table, threading her fingers through his. Their hands linked, solid, steady like a promise. No grand vows. No fancy declarations. Just presence, simple and whole. Winter passed slowly in Fair Hollow. Lucas and Caroline didn't try to build a perfect fairy tale. They lived real life. Mornings rushing late, evenings sharing dinner, reading bedtime stories to Ella and Sophie. Messy nights, overslept mornings, petty arguments, and also nights curled up on the couch with old movies. Mornings filled with laughter when Ella spilled cereal across the kitchen. Afternoons when Sophie demanded Lucas fix her broken doll, convinced he was the mechanic for the entire toy world. All those tiny, imperfect pieces wove something stronger than any promise, a life built together, a real home. And one day, in a moment no one planned, Caroline watched Lucas teaching Ella to ride her little bike, and she realized she had forgiven, not because Lucas demanded it, not because the past had disappeared, but because of love, patient, quiet, unconditional, asking for nothing more than simply continuing the journey together. She ran to them, laughing as Ella toppled into the grass, and together they lifted her back onto her feet. And in that moment, Caroline knew, forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. It grows piece by piece, with every hand held, every laugh shared, with every fall, and every time someone is there to lift you back up. That morning, the sky over Fair Hollow was a clear, fresh blue, as if it had been washed clean by the night's rain. The first sunlight poured over the small wooden house where Lucas Hart, Caroline Rhodes, and the two little girls, Ella and Sophie, now lived. A simple, weathered house, but one filled with laughter and the steady breath of healing souls. Lucas sat on the porch steps, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, his eyes following Ella as she struggled to tie the string on a kite, while Sophie raced around the yard, giggling wildly. Inside the kitchen, Caroline was baking, humming along to an old song crackling from the battered radio. No grand moments, just quiet heartbeats, just the complete presence, something Lucas once believed he would never find again. That afternoon, Caroline proposed a simple idea that made Lucas's heart skip a beat. "Maybe it's time we make it official," she said, her eyes gleaming. He looked up from the toolbox he was working on, tilting his head slightly. "Official how?" She held up a white-painted wooden sign with carefully stenciled black letters, "Hart Roads Home." No long conversations were needed. Just one shared look, and every memory, every scar, every winding road seemed to melt away, leaving only the soft weight of a new beginning. That evening, they all gathered to hang the sign over the front door. Lucas stood on the ladder, hammering in the final nail, while Ella and Sophie argued over who got to hold the hammer, under Caroline's watchful eye, of course. "You sure about this?" Caroline asked with a teasing smile as Lucas raised the sign. "I've never been more sure of anything," he answered. The final hammer strike echoed crisply, and the small sign swayed gently in the breeze, catching the last golden rays of the setting sun. Hart Roads Home. A new story had begun, and this time they were the ones writing it together. That night, Caroline spread a large blanket across the backyard, under a sky full of stars. Ella and Sophie, in their pajamas and clutching teddy bears, ran circles around them, laughter spilling into the cold night air. Lucas carried out a tray of hot cocoa, each mug topped with wobbly marshmallow sticks. They all huddled together, their breath puffing little clouds into the frosty evening. "Let's tell a story," Sophie cried. "About what?" Caroline asked, smiling. "About our family," Ella declared excitedly. Lucas chuckled, exchanging a glance with Caroline, a silent agreement passing between them. And so, one by one, they wove their story. No castles, no princes on white horses, just a man who thought he'd be lonely forever, a woman who believed her heart might never heal, two little girls who had been lost in life's storms. And somehow, against all odds, they found each other, not as perfect people, but as broken pieces that fit together in the most unexpected, beautiful way. As the storytelling faded and small hands began to rub sleepy eyes, Lucas scooped Ella into his arms while Caroline gathered Sophie close. The wind whispered through the trees, and the stars above seemed to shine brighter than ever. Caroline rested her head against Lucas's shoulder and whispered, "I used to think family was supposed to be the place that never hurt you." Lucas gently tightened his hold around her. "But actually," she continued, "family is the place where, even if it hurts, they stay." He nodded, pressing a soft kiss into her hair, "and where you learn to heal together." Later, when Lucas carried Ella and Sophie to their beds, he paused for a moment, watching their peaceful, sleeping faces. He thought back to those early days, the wary glances, the tentative steps, the silent walls built from old wounds. And yet now, only trust remained. Turning to the doorway, he found Caroline standing there, her smile warm under the soft glow of the lamp. "We've come a long way," he whispered. Caroline stepped forward, taking his hand. "And we're just getting started," she said. That night, for the first time in many years, Lucas didn't dream of what he had lost. No more explosions of memory. No more gnawing questions. Just the steady breathing of the people he loved asleep down the hall, and a deep, soul-warming sense of peace. A home, a family, not perfect, not loud, but real, achingly, beautifully real. The next morning, as the sun rose over the fields of Fair Hollow, Caroline made coffee. Lucas hammered a loose board back into place on the porch, and Ella and Sophie attempted to make breakfast, resulting in charred toast and fits of laughter. Everything was messy. Everything was beautiful. And as they sat around the worn kitchen table, laughing over the odd-shaped toast, Lucas realized happiness didn't come from erasing the past. It didn't come from pretending mistakes had never happened. Happiness came from choosing every day to keep walking forward with the ones who didn't ask you to be perfect, only to be present, to choose love, to choose forgiveness, to choose to believe that even broken hearts could build a home together. under the sign that read Hart Road's Home. In a little town that had learned how to forgive, a family was born. Not from blood, not from rules, but from the quiet, everyday choice to stay. And so, in the little house at the end of Willow Street, among winters filled with hope, their story was only just beginning. In today's world, where relationships often fracture under the weight of misunderstanding, pressure, and hurt, the story of Lucas Hart and Caroline Rhodes reminds us of something simple yet profoundly true. Family isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to stay, even when leaving would be easier. We live in an era that demands perfection in almost every aspect. A successful career, a picture-perfect family, an unblemished personal image. But like Lucas, each of us carries scars, the pains of the past, the moments of being misunderstood, the wounds inflicted by those we loved most. And like Caroline, many of us once believed in dreams so beautiful that when they shattered, we didn't just lose others, we lost parts of ourselves too. What makes their story resonate isn't that they found each other as complete, flawless people. It's that they found each other still broken. And instead of demanding perfection, they chose to patiently rebuild, piece by piece, through trust, through daily presence, through the courage to love even when fear lingered. In our modern lives, this lesson feels more urgent than ever. We can't always escape mistakes, losses, or heartbreaks. But every day, we can choose forgiveness, not to erase the pain, but to allow ourselves to move forward. We can choose to see others not only by the mistakes they've made, but by the small, often unseen efforts they make to be better. Above all, we can choose to rebuild love, not waiting for the perfect moment, but starting with the simplest acts: a held hand, a shared glance, a kind word, a warm meal. As Lucas and Caroline showed us, happiness isn't a miracle. It's the quiet result of 1,000 small, kind choices made every single day. In a world that's loud and rushed, perhaps the only true miracle we need is the bravery to stay, the faith to believe, and the courage to begin again, even from the tiniest pieces of our own hearts. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.